Thank you all for joining us today for this panel discussion on the issue of wage and benefit substitution. We have with us today Doug Cruz, who's going to be sharing his research on the topic. And we have a group of discussants that includes Richard Freeman, Paige Wimay, Marshall Vance, Matt Mazewski, Nancy Wiefek. And I think that's the entire group. So with that, I'll hand it over to Doug to share his remarks.
Very glad to be here. We're tackling a very interesting question here that hasn't received enough attention, and I'm glad to give my I'm glad to kick off this conversation with some thoughts, a review of some research on this issue of wage substitution. It really is one of the key concerns that economists in particular have about this, saying that of course there has to be some wage substitution whenever we see employee ownership. But let me get right into my presentation here, where I'll review some of those arguments and the back and forth. If I can share my screen here. So does employee ownership substitute for wages? Pro and con. I'm going to try to play both sides here and see if I can set up the debate and set up a good conversation. Does employee ownership substitute for wages or other worker benefits? First thing to say is obviously the answer is yes in some cases. There are wage and benefit concessions that sometimes involve employee ownership or stakes. But the heyday of this was really in the 1980s, and only about 4% of EO of employee ownership adoption involved concessions in the 80s. Another case where there's clear wage substitution is when employees purchase stock directly through employee stock purchase plans. Also, it can be argued that employees are doing some kind of wage substitution when they allocate part of their 401k accounts to employer stock. But those are not the majority of employee ownership. Most of it occurs through ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, or various forms of stock grants where employees are not directly trading wages for stock. Do they nonetheless accept lower wages or other benefits in exchange for employee ownership? The debate. I set up a debate here between a theoretical and empirical economist. Theoretical economist says, of course, employee ownership comes in place of wages and other benefits. The theory of compensating differentials is clear. The workers make trade-offs in markets, and if employee ownership has value to workers, then they're going to accept lower wages or benefits in exchange for it. Firms are not going to provide it as a freebie. Empirical economists could say, well, the evidence doesn't show that otherwise similar workers with employee ownership get lower wages or benefits. And I'll cover that in just a bit here. Theoretical economists could respond, well, then there's something wrong with the evidence. Empirical economists, or maybe the theory should be more rich and nuanced. So that's my quick and dirty summary of the debate. Reviewing the evidence on the relation of employee ownership to wages and benefits. I think it can be categorized into 4 basic types of empirical studies, representing the permutations of cross-sectional versus longitudinal and employee level versus firm level studies. Set up the little grid here, and I'm going to quickly review studies in each cell there. Cross-sectional employee level, cell 1. In US studies, employee owners tend to earn more and have higher benefits than otherwise similar non-owners. And I provide a number of sites here where there's been cross-sectional comparisons between employee owners and non-owners, typically controlling for education, experience, all that kind of stuff, trying to make it as apples to apples as possible. Outside of the US, there have been 2 studies on pay in worker cooperatives. One of them in Uruguay finding that the workers in the worker cooperatives have higher pay than those in conventional firms. The other one in Italy finding lower pay. So mixed results there internationally, but in the US, it's all been positive results. but I say positive. That is that employee owners tend to earn more. So that's the employee level. Cross-sectional firm level, firms with employee ownership tend to pay better than matched non-employee ownership firms. Several studies there. But there's a basic problem with cross-sectional data, as I think most of us are familiar with. There may be other unobservable differences that account for the relationship, such as the type of worker or firm that chooses employee ownership. So longitudinal data helps with this. You can do some pre-post comparisons. A longitudinal employee level studies. Esben Bake did a nice study looking at using the NLSY data, which Nancy Wiefek has used a lot. I'll be very interested to hear more about what she says. Young workers tend to see increases in pay as they join ESOP firms. As I say, Nancy has done the work on this as well. Then longitudinal firm level studies, I think, are actually the best, the highest quality data here. In firms that adopted ESOPs over 1980 to 2001, Paige Wimay is with us here, has done I think the most important study, finding that wages, excluding the ESOP value, just wages, tend to increase for small ESOPs or stay constant for large ESOPs as firms adopted ESOPs. So that would indicate that the ESOP is coming on top of standard wages. Also, more recently, in firms that adopted any employee ownership, not just ESOPs, over 1999 to 2012, Fadon Kurtulis and I found that both non-pension and pension compensation per employee increased over this period. So each type of study points to higher, not lower pay for workers who receive employee ownership. And the studies, as I said, generally control for worker quality, like education, and firm characteristics, size, industry, and so forth. But is this causal? Is there something wrong with the evidence? Are there unobservable differences that account for the positive relationship here? We can't rule these out without a true experiment. There are lab experiments that show positive effects of employee ownership arrangements. A couple of studies there, including one by Phil Melizzo, who's one of our fellows. There have not been true field experiments with employee ownership, but there was a really interesting field experiment on profit sharing, where profit sharing was randomly assigned among establishments in a fast food firm, and found that the establishments that were randomly assigned profit sharing saw a higher performance. So and improved worker pay. So I would love to see something like that in the employee ownership field. That would be a marvelous thing to get access to a company that would be willing to have such an experiment done. So how can this be? Does compensating differentials theory not apply? Is there room for more rich and nuanced theory? One good possibility, this is something I developed with Richard and Joseph Blasi. I say I developed, this is something I wrote about. The model was developed by George Akerlof, Nobel Prize winner, the economic model of gift exchange and reciprocity. In his model, workers may respond to a gift of employee ownership above market pay with a reciprocal gift of high effort, cooperation, and work standards. And I think employee ownership may be an especially effective gift for creating and reinforcing a sense of common purpose, encouraging higher commitment and productivity. It's consistent with findings that worker behavior and performance are better when employee ownership is combined with above market pay and high performance work policies, participation decisions, training, job security, and so forth. We talked a lot about this in our 2010 book. It's also consistent with evidence of the higher average performance of employee ownership firms. O'Boyle et al. Did a meta-analysis of the studies that showed quite clearly that on average, employee ownership is associated with better performance. So if the efficiency wage theory of gift exchange applies, and employee ownership is part of an above market pay package, is employee ownership substituting for pay and other benefits? Well, it depends on how you see it, depends on the nature of the comparison. There's no substitution if you're comparing to otherwise similar workers in non-employee ownership firms. The employee ownership workers are getting employee ownership on top of their alternative market wage. The employee ownership is like gravy. But more subtly, employee ownership may be substituting for other elements of an efficiency wage package. A firm may decide to provide a gift of employee ownership rather than something else, some other type of gift, vacation, flexible scheduling, whatever, in order to incentivize good behavior and performance. So it may be substituting for these other elements of the efficiency wage package. Also, compensating differentials theory may still apply. The efficiency wage package, including employee ownership, is being sustained by higher performance, and the entire package may be seen as compensation for higher quantity and quality of work by employees. In other words, maybe the compensation adjusted for effort level may be the same as in other firms. So compensating differentials may still apply in that case. Here's another possibly relevant theory, and I'll be really interested to hear what other people think about this. This is a bit speculative on my part. Labor market monopsony. That's where employer concentration is high and workers have limited options for going to other firms. Not a lot of places you can take your skills in a particular labor market. Monopsony is more common than once thought. There's been a lot of attention to it in the past couple of decades by labor economists. It is linked to lower pay levels, according to several studies. Employee preferences over pay and job characteristics are expressed well in job choices only when monopsony is low. That is, worker mobility is high. Workers have a lot of options for places to go. So maybe the lower pay in non-employee ownership firms reflects greater monopsony power in their labor markets. In other words, maybe employee ownership is more prevalent in non-monopsony markets where firms are more responsive to worker preferences and pay is higher. This is speculative. I should have put in the word highly speculative. I'm trying to reach around and find any theory that might be relevant here as to why employee ownership workers get paid more. We don't have any studies yet of employee ownership and labor market monopsony. We do know that employee ownership is linked to product market power, and not labor market power, but product market power, probably because large firms try to attract and lock in talent with employee ownership. And Phila Townsend and I did a study that's showing up on that. So, does employee ownership substitute for wages or other worker benefits? Most evidence says no. Employee ownership workers are generally paid better than otherwise similar non-employee ownership workers, and they see pay increase when they join employee ownership firms. So that sounds good for those workers. It's consistent with the efficiency wage model of gift exchange that Akerlof developed. Although, as I say, employee ownership might be seen as substituting for other elements of efficiency wage package, or compensating for higher quantity and quality of work. Also, and I really need to emphasize this, the studies are limited, especially high quality longitudinal pre-post studies comparing workers and firms before and after adopting employee ownership, such as the study that Page did. So there's definitely room for more research, as Matt Mazuski is doing with the Health and Retirement Survey, providing results for older workers to complement the NLSY results for younger workers. So that is my spiel, and I'm looking forward greatly to Matt Mazuski's presentation.
Thank you so much for that, Doug. We'll give everyone a chance to respond to what you shared, but before that, we'll hand it over to Matt to share his research.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here today. It's great to join you all for this panel, and thanks to Doug for that really excellent framing of the issues and the state of the literature. So as Doug mentioned towards the end of his presentation there, I've been working on some research using the health and retirement study, and I'll talk in a little bit about what that data set is and what we can learn from it. But just wanted to start off by commenting on this point about longitudinal versus cross-sectional data. So I think, as Doug alluded to, one of the great challenges here with trying to find evidence either for or against wage substitution in the context of employee ownership using cross-sectional data is that we may see in that cross-sectional data that it doesn't seem like ESOP benefits or employee ownership benefits more generally are substituting for wages, but maybe there's something else going on that we can't see because of the limitations of those data. So in particular, there could be selection effects where either workers are selecting into employment at ESOP or non-ESOP firms on the basis of unobserved individual characteristics that we don't get to see in the data, or firms are, as is quite likely, selecting into being employee-owned on the basis of unobserved firm characteristics. So the consequence of that is that it very well may be the case that there is some form of wage substitution happening, but we just don't see it. In other words, if ESOP firms are differentially attracting the most productive workers, we may see that workers at ESOP firms are more highly compensated, and yet it might be the case that they would be even more highly compensated if they were to work in the counterfactual scenario where they were to be working at non-ESOP firms instead. And because we can't observe that counterfactual, we might be mistakenly inferring that there is no wage substitution when in fact there is some form of wage substitution. So I think Doug is right that longitudinal data offers an attractive possibility for trying to overcome some of those challenges with cross-sectional data. So let me, if I could just share my screen here. So the data source that we use for this analysis is called the Health and Retirement Study, which is a large biennial survey of Americans over the age of 50 and their households that's administered by the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan and supported by various federal agencies. So this is a very long-running panel, was started over 30 years ago, and every wave of the survey includes approximately 20,000 respondents. The full panel by this point has over 40,000 unique individuals. And the HRS asks a really unparalleled range of questions about all sorts of topics: income, wealth, pensions, work history, demographic characteristics, health, and so on. And the individuals in this survey, as I said, are all over the age of 50, and new cohorts are added every several years to try to preserve a roughly constant age distribution over time. So importantly for our purposes, the HRS has detailed questions about the characteristics of individual pension plans. And starting in 2008, collects data on whether individuals report participating in an ESOP. And people can provide information on several pension plans per survey wave, so we can have more confidence that we're capturing the full set of pensions if individuals participate in more than one plan. And so the analysis that we're doing here makes use of data from 6 waves, sorry, I think that should be 7 waves of the survey from 2008 to 2020 that are made available by the RAND Corporation. So just to quickly go through some of what we do here at a high level, from an econometric standpoint, what we're doing is we're estimating a series of regressions where we're looking at wages as an outcome. And there are several different measures of income that we can look at in the HRS. Individuals are asked about their earnings in several different ways. which gives us a way to do kind of robustness checks to look at what happens when we alter the precise measure of wages or earned income that is used. And so in the first pass, what we're doing here is we're essentially treating the data as a series of repeated cross sections. So we're not really fully exploiting the panel structure of the data just yet. We're just trying to see if we treat this just as cross-sectional data, what do we see? And so we're including controls here for demographic characteristics, job characteristics, things like tenure on the job, education level, and so on. And what we're really interested in estimating here is the effect of ESOP participation on wages. So the basic question here is, all else equal, when compared to similarly situated workers, how does participating in an ESOP affect your wages? So if we think that there's wage substitution going on, and that's something that we can detect in these data, we should see that the effect of ESOP participation on wages is negative. In other words, all else equal, people who have an ESOP should be earning less than comparably situated peers. And so in this table, what we show is the results of running this exercise using two alternative measures of wages that we take from the HRS data. And so what you should be paying attention to here are these numbers in the very first row of the table. And the interpretation there is that for our first measure of wages in the first column, participation in an ESOP is associated with about a 6.5% increase in wages. And using our second alternative measure of wages, participation in an ESOP is associated with about a 19.5% increase in wages. And in the second case, the stars are telling us that that effect is highly statistically significant based on this setup. And so what we're seeing here is that at least in that basic approach, we don't see evidence of wage substitution, which is consistent with all the evidence that Doug presented earlier. We either see a small and insignificant effect or a large and positive and significant effect, but we don't see any evidence of a negative effect. Okay, but as I said, that's sort of the benchmark case. We're not really accounting for any of these possible selection effects, any effect of workers sorting into employee-owned firms on the basis of their productivity or anything like that. And that's where we can really leverage the structure of the HRS data to try to do something that hasn't necessarily been done before. So in our second pass, what we do is, because we can track particular individuals over time, because we get to see people over a period of many years, we can control for individual characteristics. So in econometric terms, we can include an individual fixed effect, meaning that we're essentially making comparisons of wages for the same individuals who might be moving into or out of ESOP participation over time. And so we're effectively using individuals as their own controls, comparing what happens to wages when a person who previously did not participate in an ESOP begins to participate in an ESOP, or vice versa. Okay, and so here we find broadly similar story. The estimates are changed a little bit, both in magnitude and significance. So using our first wage measure, we find this coefficient here indicates about a 20% wage premium for ESOP workers versus non-ESOP workers. And using the second wage measure now is reduced to about a 5% premium. So again, however, we don't see in either case a negative estimate, meaning even when we account for the effect of individual characteristics, we're still not seeing any clear evidence of wage substitution. Okay, so one potential objection that could still be raised is, we're still not accounting for potential unobservable characteristics of firms themselves. And as I said earlier, there are clear reasons to think that firms are selecting into offering or not offering ESOPs on the basis of various factors that are not necessarily going to be observable in most data sets. And so fortunately for our purposes, we can also see in the HRS data when individuals are switching between jobs. So in each wave of this survey, people are asked, are you working in the same job that you were working in the previous wave when we last interviewed you, if you're not a new participant in the survey? And so what's useful about that is that we can construct indicators for when people are at the same firm as they were previously and when they've switched to a new firm. And so we can see, if we look at people that are in a unique spell of employment with a particular firm, whether that firm has switched from offering an ESOP to not offering one, or vice versa. So we can see people switching into or out of ESOPs because of changes within an employment spell. And so when we run our final specification, where we're now controlling for those job effects, we see something now very broadly similar to what we got in our initial analysis, where we were just treating the data as repeated cross sections. So we see, again, somewhere between a 5% and 18% wage premium for ESOP workers, only statistically significant in the case of one of our wage measures. And in the paper that we're working on, we do a whole additional set of robustness tests to try to get at why we might be seeing some divergence in the results when we use these two different wage measures. But suffice it to say that after running all of these tests, we don't in any case ever see a negative effect of ESOP participation on wages, which suggests that even when trying to account for some of these unobserved sources of variation that previous research has not really been able to account for, we do not see any evidence that that ESOPs are substituting for cash compensation. And so I think I appreciated Doug's discussion at the end about thinking through some possible theoretical mechanisms for how this could be the case. I think economists might get a little bit nervous about some of these findings. Standard economic theory would suggest that for workers of similar ability, we should see roughly similar wages across different jobs. And I think the fact that we don't is something that we need to have convincing models to explain. And I really like the discussion about monopsony power. I think it could be useful to look to the literature on union wage premia, which is much more extensive than the literature on ESOP wage premia, to think through some of the possible mechanisms here. Yeah, I'm really excited to see where Doug's research goes next, especially around monopsony and some of the ideas related to trying to randomize employee ownership, which I think would really convincingly overcome some of these challenges around non-random assignment of workers and firms to employee ownership. So thanks very much, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Matt, for sharing that additional research. With that, I'll hand it over to the discussants to share their reactions to both Doug and Matt's remarks. Marshall, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so I really enjoyed both Doug and Matt's presentations. I think that Doug did a fantastic job of laying out the basic intuition for why economists think that this substitution has to be happening. And Matt did a great job of laying out a particularly compelling case showing that it's hard to observe, or at least in the ESOP setting, it's hard to actually observe the substitution happening despite the economists' expectations. So one thing, I guess I'll go in a slightly different direction for a different reason why I think that economists, especially those economists working in this space, have such strong priors that there should be substitution going on. And that is just taking it all the way back to why are we using equity compensation in the first place? And I know I say this in this setting every single time. I feel like every time I've ever presented this group, I have to mention a lot of economists are very skeptical about the incentive effects of equity compensation plans, especially broad-based stock options or broad-based restricted stock plans. And so in the absence of a compelling theoretical reason for why those would be providing incentives, researchers have looked for other motivations for providing equity compensation to lower level employees. And going all the way back to the early 2000s, there was a paper by Paul Oyer, and he suggested, well, maybe it's not for incentives at all. Maybe it's really for sorting or retention purposes. And so this idea of sorting or retention have become, among many economists, the dominant explanations for why we see equity compensation plans. And under a sorting story, the idea being if I choose to provide equity compensation, some employees are going to really like that, and some employees are not going to like it as much. And so if I take away some of the cash pay, in other words, if I substitute and put in equity compensation, then I will be able to attract or retain differentially those employees who value it highly. And if employees who value it highly are more attractive because they're more optimistic employees, or because they have appealing views of management or things like that, then that could be an explanation for why we use it. The problem is the sorting story really goes away if you don't accept that substitution is happening here. Without substitution, even an employee who is extremely pessimistic about a firm's future prospects, if you give them the same $100 that everyone else is offering, and then layer on an extra bit of stock options or restricted stock, even if they think that's virtually worthless, it's still worth something, and they would be more likely to choose that. So the sorting story breaks down if you don't have substitution happening here. And I'll say, I personally have work in this space looking at sorting, and we say right in the paper that following other studies, we assume that substitution is happening. And I cite other fellows from the Institute. And so this is a common idea that's happening, even among this group. And so I think to really get at this issue, a helpful way to, or at least an alternative way to think about it is, can we do a better job of maybe continuing to address this issue of, can we nail down why companies are using equity compensation? Is it for sorting? Is it for retention? Or is it for incentives? And as I've said, there is just a large wall of skepticism about the incentive explanation for broad-based equity plans in particular. And so I think the more fundamental issue is that we actually don't know a lot, and I say we meaning academics, don't know a lot about the institutional factors that are driving the use of these equity compensation plans. And that causes us to look to economists to come up with models that will help us to try to explain these things. But I think a straightforward way that we could approach this is to actually ask practitioners. And I think that this forum or this setting, the Institute, is really well situated to provide that kind of evidence, because we do have a lot of interaction, particularly relative to other academic conferences, between academics and practitioners. We could ask them. We could put together some qualitative research that actually gets at asking practitioners who are the ones designing and administering equity compensation plans for large public companies, for example, what are the factors? How do you go about this? Do you start off with an overall budget, and from there you separate out, this is how much goes to equity pay, this is how much goes to cash pay? Or do they have separate budgets for cash and then layer on equity on top of that? I think that that'd be really helpful. Just what I've seen is almost invariably we cite papers from the early 2000s when we say this is what we know about the motivations for using equity compensation. And those papers, the ones that are based on survey data, will take surveys from the late 90s. And many of those surveys were actually not done by academics. And so there could be psychometric or there could be selection issues that have never really been addressed. So I think that's the first obvious way that we could approach this, is just go more rigorously into qualitatively understanding why companies do this. What do they say? And if they say we're using this to provide incentives to low-level employees, maybe we should just take them at face value. Maybe we should actually believe what they're saying rather than continue to say, no, it can't be that, free riding and other reasons. The other thing I think that we can do is maybe look for some more exogenous changes in equity compensation plans. And so I think one way to look at that would be to look at so the FAS 123R, the ASC 718, when stock options had to be expensed. I think that many companies scaled back. And to the extent that some companies stopped providing equity compensation, maybe we can look at some of the census data, like what Page has done, and just see what was the effect of rolling that back, where we have now a relatively exogenous change in the use of equity compensation for lower level employees. Similarly, we have more recently with the Say on Pay and with the rise of influence by proxy advisors have been known not to like broad-based equity compensation. I have research that shows that they have heavily influenced companies to decrease the use of broad-based equity compensation. So again, if we can see companies that have stopped using equity compensation, what do we see using, say, census data? Are they now layering on top, substituting back the cash pay that they previously had taken away? And if we don't see that, again, that would suggest that maybe substitution isn't happening. Potentially, we might see something with changes in minimum wage laws, or again, we can look at census data. Is it the case that those companies that do pay equity compensation, if they're forced to increase the minimum wage, to the extent that there is overlap between workers in the minimum wage group and those receiving equity, do we see them then scaling back that equity because now they've been exogenously required to pay more cash? Do we see that scaling back? So I think that there are a number of ways that we can start to think about this both qualitatively and potentially empirically to try to address this issue more specifically. But going back to the studies that Doug referenced and that Matt showed, if we're looking around, and sure, each of these studies do have their issues. None of them are bulletproof. But if it's that hard to find the substitution in the data, that suggests that maybe substitution at a minimum is not a first order concern that we observe. And so, yeah, I think it's a really interesting issue, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other panelists' thoughts.
Sure, thank you for that. That was really thoughtful. I'd like to hand it over to Richard for your thoughts.
Okay, when I first saw this as being the question, I thought it was weird. Firms and ourselves, when we want to give ourselves rewards for doing things, we often set up kinked reward structures so that your dessert, you wait till the end and you've eaten all of your potatoes and meat or whatever it is, and then boom, then you get the prize. And the equity compensation is a form of a kinked schedule in some sense. It's putting in a chunk of resources at the end for you that you have. And we have Doug talked about efficiency wages. That's basically the same kind of structure. And most firms don't want to pay it hourly. They would much rather pay some form of incentive pay, piece rate, if you can do it, because we know people produce more when they're paid in a non-hourly way. So I would just start off. The basic thing should be not the substitution issue. But it should be that we're all looking around for these ways to incentivize people to do better. This is one method. Whether it works better or worse than some piece rate pay would be interesting to see. And ultimately, it's not the well, it's going to try to be the same thing of saying there is no incentives. It's if the value of the ESOP plus the value of your wage payments at a particular firm is higher than, let's say, what they're giving you at an hourly wage firm in total, then we know the firm is only going to do that if the productivity is higher. they're not giving you that money if your productivity is the same. So to me, I would sort of look at these guys and Doug's theorists and say, hey, this is such a simple theory and you don't use it anywhere else. And that it makes very little sense. As long as the productivity is higher and it gave people the motivation to do that, yes, it got distributed this way. We might have distributed it another way, and that gets more complicated. But this is a way that works. And Marshall said something about some people are very suspicious of it for ordinary workers, but not for big players. That's a very weird view of human nature. The rich guy has these special incentives that differ from the normal person. And it's just weird. I could put it that way. So I just think this is actually, the theory says that people's tastes are such that kinked curves, paying people not hourly pay, but doing piece rate, doing a special bonus, doing some equity kick, those things tend to work. Now, there's another issue which has to do not with how people behave, which I think is just fine. The equity stuff, you could compare it to some other forms of kinked wages, where we give you something extra if you do extra performance. It's will we see other firms then copy you? And if workers have different tastes, will we see some kinds of workers sort themselves into the employee-owned firm? And some others will say, no, I just want to do hourly wages. I don't want to have any real dot. And if the compensating differential market theory is based on that, that's hard to disprove. But obviously you can see who leaves the company. And if it's all the loafers leave, and in Matt's data, he has people leaving an ESOP firm, and he has people coming to the ESOP firm, and he didn't distinguish them in the calculations he gave us, but that you certainly can look at. Is it that guys who are just not doing very well leave? And then you got to compare them to guys who are not doing very well at another firm. And then you look at people who come in. The sorting is something valid, but it's economically useful. You want to get all the people on a team who want to be on the team and want to produce in a team-like setting. You don't want to have the one guy there who's sitting in a corner. I don't like working with anybody else. You want to get that guy out as quick as can be. That's a market sorting people out. And I can understand you may have a theory that says, well, if you take account that that guy doesn't like working with teams, you may have some compensating differential kind of thing that you would use to interpret it. But I don't think that's a very fruitful way of looking at this. And then let me make one other comment. Compensating differentials is one of the hardest theories we have to find good evidence for. And so for people to criticize ESOP things on the notion that we have this great theory, we know that the minute anybody gets anything extra, there should be some penalty so the firm can take it away from them. That just looks crazy. And we have an example today that's ongoing, which is just, to me, remarkable. A lot of workers want to work from home. And a lot of firms want them to work in the office. It's very debatable where the productivity lies. There's evidence on both sides. I don't find anything, compelling except for individual firms or some markets where it looks. And they're fighting over this. We have not seen this equilibrate. Compensating differential view would be, workers want to work from home, fine. Duck their pay 20%. And now you can work from home. And the worker can go to the firm and say, wait a second, you don't need an office for me. You've just saved a huge amount of money. Hey, you got to give me some of those profits. And that is closer to an ESOP, I think, where the productivity is there. And the question is, how do you divide up the extra productivity from this or work form? So I would push back very hard on your theorists, Doug. And if you have any strong evidence, yeah, empiricists will always prepared to back off if the evidence says no. But if it says yes, why are you spending your time thinking of theories that say no? That's ridiculous.
Thank you for that, Richard. Nancy, would love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. This is very, very interesting, especially to a non-economist. So I have, I feel like this is a good opportunity for me to rail against the clumping together of different types of employee ownership, which I think can really obscure things. So, but also could help. So if by not kind of lumping in an ESOP with a large corporation that voluntarily decides they're going to give compensation to broadly to, you know, all workers, to me, it becomes difficult then to know what economists are saying why there should be wage substitution. Because what's the cost? What are we talking about as the cost? In an ESOP, things are very, very different than in a equity comp plan. And there's tax benefits and there's all these different things that I think somewhat muddy the waters. And there's a couple other things, you know, so, and you guys, it isn't like you all haven't brought this up, but for me, ESOPs really are a special kind of a special case that can be enlightening by breaking it out. Firms have to be more successful to do an ESOP. You all brought that up. I think too, I wouldn't necessarily think that we should have all benefit types on the same realm, given the same value. So being able to take another week off of vacation shouldn't be on the same platform or of the same value as you're actually going to be able to retire with some security. And given that so many people have nothing to retire on, and and that eats at you day after day, that in and of itself has more value or should be counted as more in some way. And also too, to me, there's ESOP workers have to do more work. So, and I know, Doug, you mentioned this in terms of really, if we looked at the work that people do at an ESOP, and again, I'm going to break that out, they are doing more work. They're having to come up with ideas. They're having to kind of sit there and actually pay attention. They're having to fight their urge to not want to kind of deal with people. They have to do it. And so they're actually putting in more sweat and toil when it comes down to it. So that's kind of like in a nutshell, I'm sort of saying, let's break them out. Let's look at them in particular. Let's break out voluntary versus a required broad-based, and put retirement security in its own kind of, only with ESOPs are you getting that retirement security, and that just is a kind of different animal. But thank you for the opportunity to discuss your work, Doug. You do amazing work. And so for Matt, can you please remind me, what are the ages of the folks in the HRS?
Yeah, so these are older workers. They're 50 and up.
Gotcha. Okay, so then I would raise a big flag, because the data itself, I think it's amazing you digging into it. I think we have so much to learn about older workers, but them moving in and out with a 50+ worker moving into an ESOP, I'm not so sure I would feel confident that that's not super, what do I want to say? Like an outlier kind of. And I'm not here saying 50 is old. But but it is, I think those folks that are able to get into an ESOP at 55 is a different animal altogether. But that's not your, that's not your fault. That is what the data is. But just in terms of the moving in and out, and the moving in and out, I get the heebie-jeebies when people talk about the moving in and out as though people have a choice to work at an ESOP. And I don't think that's true. I wish it were. I wish people, I think it's similar to unions. I don't think you can get to walk to a union if you want union benefits. People don't know about ESOPs. They get there by accident. And so I temper that always when I kind of hear that. Into 50 plus. So how many are still working? I guess it's a fairly big, you probably get you got maybe 6,000 plus of folks that get into this while they're still in the workforce, into the HR CS.
Yeah. So how many are still working? You mean like what fraction?
I reckon that's what I mean. Yeah, because in my head I was thinking it was all retired folks. And so I think you must have a sizable chunk in there that aren't yet.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I can't tell you off the top of my head, like at a particular age, what fraction are retired. But what I can say is that it's by no means just a data set of retirees. And one of the most interesting things about the data set is that for most people, you're able to track them from work into retirement.
That's really something.
Which is really a feature that I think you don't find in a lot of places.
Gotcha. Thanks very much, Matt. It's amazing work. That I can imagine that data set is rich yet difficult. So that's it. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you, Nancy. And Paige, it'd be great to hear from you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for including me on this panel. And the wonderful thing of going last is I get to hear all of the interesting comments everyone has said. So I will be briefer. I'm just going to try to add a few points that I think have not yet been brought up. So I wanted to start by talking about some of the concerns with the longitudinal studies, and I'm going to pick on my paper. And I think the concern I want to make sure everyone is aware of with the longitudinal studies is it's true. We don't have the same issues with the cross section where firms with ESOPs are just inherently different of firms without ESOPs. But when you have the longitudinal study, the concern you have is why did they implement the ESOP today? And they didn't do it 5 years ago, or they didn't do it 5 years in the future. And it's not random. People don't sort of wake up and get ESOP sprinkled down on them. They're making a decision, and presumably they're making that decision because they anticipate some different characteristics in the future. And so my worry always, and this is my concern in that paper, and we clarify it, is the worry is that firms may choose to adopt an ESOP at a point in time when they're anticipating higher future profit, because then they have essentially more surplus to be able to share. And so to the extent that that is true, then that could cause a sort of a non-causation explanation of some of these results. And I just bring this up to give ourselves pause and sort of over interpreting these results. At the end of the day, there's still correlations. But I do want to point everyone to this beautiful new paper. This is by Elio, Schreier, and Thesmar. So this is a little bit different. So this uses a shock in France. And so what it's doing is it's looking at this law change in France, where previously in France, if you had 100 employees, you had to share a certain percentage of your profits with workers. So not an ESOP, it's profit sharing, but you can see the similarities. And what they did is there was a change in 1990, which said now it applies if you have 50 or more employees. So from sort of an academic point of view, these new regulatory shocks are wonderful because it's essentially exogenous from the point of view of the firm. Suddenly this new law comes out. Firms have to change. It's not their choice. They're not doing it because they anticipate some different events in the future. And so what they find there, and they have beautiful administrative data, it's extraordinarily well done paper. And what they find is no impact on wages. So essentially what happens is workers get these profit sharing and there is no change to wages. Now, there are differences France has a very different set of legal requirements around labor. There's higher rates of unionization. So I think there are some limits of generalizability here, but I do think it is very interesting evidence along this debate. And then I guess the last point I would make is I'm not so concerned about this, to be honest. I mean, my view is, yes, neoclassical models, say workers should be paid exactly at their marginal productivity. But I think theorists, they need to simplify the world to be able to explain it in a model. And I don't think at least my interpretation of it has never been that that's meant to actually hold. And my point is job search is costly. I mean, none of us here know every other possible job that we could be in and all of the wages and benefits of those other jobs. And so we continue in our current job. And I think we see this in wages. We know some firms pay higher wages, some firms pay lower wages. It exists there. So I don't see it as a challenge for employee ownership because we see this everywhere else. And I think particularly in non-wage benefits, it's very hard to have information about these when you're sitting outside of the firm. So I do some other work more recently that looks at other non-wage benefits. And so we're using administrative data where we have estimates of things like healthcare costs and retirement costs at the employer job level. And then we can identify some sorts of what we would call quasi-exogenous variation in some of these costs. So reasons why your healthcare costs might be higher, but have nothing to do with your expected wages. And we're not seeing evidence of any sort of wage substitution in here. I'm not saying there's none. I think there's some, and I'm being a bit vague because this is probably getting off topic. But the point is, I think we see this everywhere. And I don't see this as some giant puzzle that needs to be solved. And with that, I just want to echo Nancy's comment about retirement security and to what extent can we do to improve retirement security for Americans, I just think is a top topic and love to hear people thinking about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Paige. So now we'll transition to just a broader conversation, give you all a chance to react to what your peers have shared and give, Doug and Matt an opportunity to respond to some of the comments as well.
Well, I'll just say I really found this interesting. I really found all these comments quite interesting and points very well taken. I especially like Marshall and Paige are both talking about the value of exogenous variation, such as provided by laws. And Marshall mentioned the idea of minimum wage laws. That's intriguing. Now I'm tempted to run some regressions and see if as state minimum wages go up, what does that do to ESOP prevalence by state? You've given me a fun Friday evening of activity to do here. But the general point is I really like that idea of looking at the exogenous variation, especially as introduced by laws here, such as the one in France for profit sharing.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that, just want to echo Doug's comments about this being a really fascinating discussion, and it's been illuminating to hear everyone's perspectives. I guess I would just want to make one empirical point and then one more theoretical point. So I appreciate the comments from Paige and Nancy about some of the empirical limitations, even with longitudinal data in trying to do causal inference. And absolutely agree that these policy variations are really the gold standard and what you would want to have if you're interested in trying to find causal evidence. To the point about firms adopting ESOPs non-randomly and how that could contaminate these estimates in a sense. I think one thing that is potentially encouraging about what we're able to do with the HRS data is that we can try to account both for firms introducing ESOPs that did not have them previously and offering them to the workers that are already there, and also workers moving between firms. And so the fact that we're able to do both sorts of comparisons and see broadly the same results, I think can potentially give more confidence in that finding, although, as you say, those concerns are always lurking there in the background. And I think to Nancy's point about how people are not necessarily, because awareness of ESOPs is generally very low, people are not necessarily seeking out employment at ESOPs and are just landing there accidentally in a lot of cases. I think potentially that actually assuages some of the concerns about non-random selection. If people are effectively randomly switching between non-ESOP and ESOP employment, I think that could actually give greater confidence in the results of an analysis where you're comparing those workers before and after those transitions. The theoretical point I wanted to make was just about why I think it is important to have some understanding of what the mechanisms are and what the potential models are that could explain what's going on, in part because I think there are maybe different policy implications depending on what model you have in mind. And so Richard was talking a lot about the incentive effects and the idea that if you design a different compensation contract that's able to motivate greater effort, you can improve productivity, and then you have a larger pie to divide among all the stakeholders. I think Doug also talked about the monopsony idea, labor market power idea, which to me, the way that I think about that is that even if there are no differences in productivity, if there are differences in bargaining power between employer and employees, there could be a different split of that surplus. The pie could be divided in a different way, even if it's the same size. And so I think that, from the standpoint of policy, like if you think that the labor market power story is the one that's more important, then potentially you would want to make sure that you're designing, you're encouraging employee ownership arrangements that are actually giving more bargaining power to workers, that are not just, I think a lot of this discussion has proceeded on the assumption that we still have the employer designing the contract that is then offered to the worker and just accepted or rejected. And I think that, to the extent that workers have more of a say in how those compensation arrangements are being designed in the first place, that's an important consideration. And so, encouraging forms of employee ownership that are actually also giving voice and not just, a share of the profits. I think that's something important to think about.
Any reactions to commentary from Doug or Matt or any of what's been shared as you all did your round robin?
Well, let me just add a couple of other notes. One is that I like Marshall's idea of doing some more kind of qualitative institutional analysis here of why firms offer these plans. And in particular, it would be very interesting to see, do they have separate budgets, as Marshall said? Do they have separate budgets for the for basic compensation and then for equity compensation? And are those decisions made together by the compensation vice president, by the master of all this, or are those decisions made to some extent somewhat separately? That would be very interesting. I also appreciate what Paige said about the fact that even with longitudinal data, pre-post data, we don't we control for any firm specific unobservables, but the timing may be very important here. The firms don't randomly choose when to adopt employee ownership as we researchers would prefer, but they choose when profits are going to be high. And that does raise a concern that perhaps a selection concern, that when firms, some firms adopt employee ownership, ESOPs, other form of employee ownership, and productivity goes up, so they reward workers, and the compensation looks better. There's no wage substitution. In other firms, they may adopt employership of some form, and productivity doesn't go up. Perhaps performance even goes down a bit, so they get rid of it. So we don't observe it in that case. And that's maybe why, especially with cross-sectional data, maybe why we see higher pay for the employership workers. That the ones where productivity didn't go up, where the firm couldn't compensate workers with higher pay, those employership arrangements have disappeared. So there is a real selection issue there, and that goes back to this issue that I would love to find a large firm that wants to implement employee ownership, just as this fast food franchise did with the profit sharing. I'd love to find a large firm that wants to implement employee ownership, but is willing to do this in some kind of experimental way to find out what the real effect is. If we can randomly assign incentives among establishments that are fairly disconnected with each other, so the workers aren't talking to each other about it, and see what the effects would be. I think that would just be a path-breaking kind of study to do.
Can I just add one thing on Doug's comment that came to mind, which is one other sort of complication in estimating this that I just want to add is when we estimate as economists, we're estimating a mean effect. And, Doug's work and Richard's work have really gotten at this, which is it depends on how you implement it. It depends on whether you have these managerial practices that are going to encourage sort of the good things that come out of employee ownership. And so I do think, ideally, it's not just sort of a measure of employee ownership, but it's also employee ownership. And then how are you doing it? And how does the management work with the employees? I think that's where we're going to really understand. And to some extent, the mean effect to me is a little less interesting than knowing what it could be if you did it correctly.
Yeah, I mean, that raises a question, Doug, where you want to see randomization. There's no company in the world that is going to do this. And why? Because if they decide to do something, they're going to bring all the other things that Paige said. And so the randomization almost has to be of the company would do all these things. And then if that succeeds, that's your random thing with all the other stuff involved. They're not going to do and which raises an interesting question. How did this profit sharing thing go on? You mean they had no program telling workers profit sharing is a good idea? There was just no discussion. It's not taking a pill in a that's all you do, and the placebo, etc. And even in those cases, who knows how the doctors are telling you things that may be very, can affect your well-being.
That's a really good point. And in the profit sharing one, they had 18 franchises. They're not franchises, I'm sorry, 18 establishments. And they did a variety of financial and non-financial incentives. There were like 3 or 4 different types of incentives they randomized among these establishments. It turns out, actually, they were able to get monthly data on productivity data here on turnover and on service quality and all of that. After 9 months of this experiment, the results were so positive for profit sharing that they decided to stop. The company said, okay, we're stopping this experiment. We're giving it to everyone now. But yeah, in that case, obviously there wasn't any kind of coordinated company level message, because that would ruin the experiment. It was very much an establishment level thing of, okay, here's a set of incentives for you. But yeah, it really Excuse me. I get all choked up talking about this topic. It very much relates to what Paige was saying, that the interactions there, I think, are extremely important.
Any other comments or reflections that anyone wants to share?
I'll just jump in and echo something that Nancy pointed out that I think is very related to this as well. In addition to the different ways that it's implemented, I think we just have a tendency in much of the literature, this isn't necessarily specific to this question, we have a tendency to, treat employee ownership as if it were just a binary variable. There's one way to do employee ownership. And so, of course, as Paige mentioned, there are different ways of implementing it and communicating it and management practices that complement it, but they're also just very fundamentally different functional forms. So like an ESOP versus stock options versus restricted shares and things like that. And I just think the more that we're able to appreciate the differences among those different vehicles, we'll be better able to answer why are they using these things. And I think ultimately that gets back, if we can really answer why are they using it, we're able to understand better the match of what we're observing in practice with the theory, as Matt was kind of talking about.
I think that I think I would want to say two things. One is what strikes me about what you're referencing, Doug, and the profit sharing is I think there's definitely sort of a different impact. If you're a low-wage worker and somebody says you matter enough that you're going to get profit sharing, you're going to share in the profits of this company. I feel like that, especially with the customer relations piece of it, customer quality interaction, it just matters. And I don't think they're going home and doing cost benefit analysis. I think that there's something there that is number one, class differences, and number two, just in the very name of things, you're going to share in the profits. It has a benefit, it has a value that is intangible almost, I think, and particularly for low-wage workers who feel just so put upon and they have to deal with just nasty customers. And then the second thing I would say too is that for in an ESOP case, I always want to push back a little bit in terms of the idea that there has to be, the way it's done is very important to whether or not it'll show an impact on corporate performance. I think that probably is, I think, you guys have done the research that shows that really matters in terms of corporate performance, but in terms of a benefit for a worker, I always like to sort of reiterate that getting that benefit, number one, feeling like you matter enough that you're in the deal, you matter enough that you're a part of this, even if they don't have any good ESOP committee, or even if they're not doing all the best practices, that matters. And the retirement security, just hands down, that retirement security, even if the corporation does not know how to do the communications piece and they're not doing the engagement and they don't have open book, they put that money in that account. That is an enormous, and they're still able to perform. They're not knocked out of business, is an amazing finding in and of itself about ESOPs in particular.
Any final reflections? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for participating in this discussion today. Doug and Matt, thank you for those excellent presentations. And Marshall, Nancy, Richard, and Paige, thank you for your contributions and thoughts. And I hope everybody enjoyed this panel today. And I think with that, we can close.
You all.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. This is very interesting.